Hi, everyone. Today, we'll be talking about Tete.Depunk's story about Andrei, 70 Fierce Years, which has recently been released as a short Kindle ebook on Amazon. Please feel free to check it out. There will be a link in the description below. So, in this book, Andrei is a Cossack from the early 20th century. And today, we'll be specifically talking about his wife Dasha's father, Lukyan, who later becomes Andrei's enemy. So first of all, Tete, can you tell us more about who Lukyan is? What role does he play in the Cossack community?
Excellent question. Excellent question. Lukian, so the thing is, he is told from Andrei's point of view, which kind of gives us a limitation of who he really is and nuances and things of that nature. So to essentially kind of sum it up from um, Andrei's viewpoint, Lukian is, of course, Dasha's father, and from what Andrei can gather from what his grandfather and father have talked about, there's been a bit of bad blood between, Andrei's family, the Novoshkanovs, and the Tarasevs, which is Dasha's family, her father's family. And to sum it up, just to sum it up easily, um, so the Stanitsa is pretty sizable. It spreads out, so you have a number of Cossack families and things like that. So the Tarsievs are, kind of like on the further boundaries of the Stanitsa, and they are considered sort of a generational messed up kind of family. While Lukian isn't an alcoholic like his father, he has a lot of messed up psychological problems and is a compulsive gambler and is just kind of scary because he's emotionally deadpan and stuff like that, which alarms most of the community because everybody else is kind of emotionally open. um Lukian is an officer, so he's also like a commanding officer. It is sort of a minor to moderate rank that he has, which we'll probably explore further in the novel, because ranks in Cossack detachments differ from, standard Russian imperial ranks, the names and things like that, and what the function is. So we'll get into those nit details in the book. But essentially, and I would have to say he is about a rank above what Andrei's father is. So, um, and how do I say, Lukian is he's also a bit of an sort of a recluse. He doesn't really get involved that much in the Cossack community, and of course this sort of makes the other ones, kind of suspicious of him, and they just generally want to ignore him, and they don't want him darkening their path, because he's just a scary dude overall, because you don't know how he's going to react. I mean, at least if someone is open emotionally or shows a lot of anger or stuff like that, at least that gives you a warning sign. But with Lukian, it doesn't, because he's very cold, very deadpan. It's like the heart and soul was ripped out of him. Um, but basically, I, I, so he's considered in the community, but not really someone anybody considers, or if they do, it's like, okay, that's a scary cold dude, don't want to have anything to do with him. You really feel sorry for his wife and his daughter, that they're stuck with him. And it's just one of those things where you push it in the back of your mind and you try not to think about it.
I see, I see. Yep, that's really great. Thank you so much for summarizing it. And it seems like Lukyan in many ways is the complete opposite of Andrei.
Yes, pretty much. Um, he pretty much is. And I would also say probably sort of a nuanced opposite of Andrei's father, Danilo. And I say that because, Andrei, even though he he didn't spend as much time with his father as he did his grandfather because of a lot of service and being stationed away and things like that, because of how the czar system was kind of messed up with how they did stationing and service terms. Andrei does respect and admire and love his father. His father is a very quiet, gentle man. Which is, I mean, not entirely unusual. Like I said, I like to make people human and nuanced and different personalities because they're human. They're not always. You can't just say, oh, everyone is the same and has the same personality. That's just rubbish stereotype. But Danilo is, he's very quiet. He's very thoughtful. He's very reserved. He'll only talk when, he feels like something should be resolved or something should be said. He's, very well mannered. I would say that maybe his only flaw is that he's a little too passive about things, and that he kind of resigns things to fate a bit. Kind of fatalistic about stuff. And also Danilo is the sort of type, and this is kind of a trait Andrei gets a little bit, that once you've hurt him or he feels betrayed, he will never forgive you. I mean, no. I mean, hell could freeze over before he thinks about, doing that. Um, but so we've got two quiet men here. Sounds like a Western, two quiet men. But there's nuances with that opposite. Like Danilo, you sort of get a sense because he communicates. Lukyan doesn't communicate, and I mean there can just be silent spouts of violence from Lukyan, while Danilo, on the other hand, has seldom used violence, and it's maybe not been in the home, maybe one or two incidences that nobody can really remember that happened with Danilo, but with Lukyan, on the other hand, it's pretty much why, Dasha's had a pretty unsettling childhood. And of course, we'll be delving into big spoilers tonight. But yes, for Andrei, it is the opposite. Andrei is Andrei is loud, vocal. Andrei expresses his anger. Now, Andrei's not, full with malice or anything. I mean, Andrei gets angry for, justified reasons. Andrei expresses his anger in a variety of ways. I think Andrei's not really prone to any kind of physical violence unless it's with another man. I mean, it's outside. I mean, he's not going to do it inside the house. I mean, he's going to, take it outside and do, mano y mano, and of course, Andrei is a sort of person where he doesn't believe in getting mad with anybody who's not on the same level of him. Like, what I mean by that, I mean in terms of, strength and lack of vulnerability. For example, Andrei wouldn't pick a fight with his aunt, or well, not pick a fight, but he wouldn't engage in conflict with his aunt or Dasha, or even his dad or grandfather. I mean, now maybe he'll bicker a bit with his granddad because granddad had it coming. But if you're not part of the family or the home, run for the hills, because you've just unleashed hell right there. But with the opposites, because Lukyan is just very scary and dangerous in the respect that he's sort of like a cobra. You don't know when they strike. You know what I mean? They could just be sitting there, and then they strike all of a sudden. So yeah, opposites, very much opposite, and of course the nuanced opposite with Danilo as well.
Mm-hmm. That makes sense. I think that makes for a very balanced cast of characters with our main male characters.
It does. Nuance and just making people as real people, not as, stock and block stereotypes, caricatures or anything like that. Just because you're, living in a setting or a society or anything, that still doesn't, entirely dictate who you are. I mean, it will influence your actions, maybe how you react to some things. But deep down, every human being has their own unique, hallmark, trademark of who they are.
Mm-hmm. I see. So what would you say are Lukyan's worst traits, if that's possible? I know most of his traits are negative, but what would you say are his worst traits? And what would
Yeah.
you say are his most positive ones?
Well, this is where we really get into a morally complicated area, and I'm really glad we've asked this question. Um, Lukyan's worst traits, I think we need to kind of start from, childhood. And of course, this isn't by no means excusing it. There's a difference between excusing something and explaining something. Um, Lukyan is, I would have to say, he's kind of on the same, the same, if you will, maybe category as Nikolai, Gleb's father, and the fact that circumstances, fate, and other factors in society turned a potentially good man into something really terrible. And I will say that because, how do I say, Lukyan, we'll just begin with Lukyan's childhood. So Lukyan was born into, average Cossack home, felt a lot of pressures to succeed in the military. His father, unfortunately, was a very abusive, very violent alcoholic who just couldn't keep any semblance of structure in the family and pretty much made Lukyan's, life a living nightmare. Lukyan had a younger brother, Evsei, so we'll be seeing him in a later thing that will maybe spoil in this podcast or not. Um, I would say, I think maybe we should start with Lukyan's best, traits. I think Lukyan had the potential that I think he wants to love. I mean, he certainly loved his little brother. He tried very hard to protect his little brother from his father's abuse and violence and other things. I think he tried to shield his brother from many of the horrors that can come from, a violent home. And, I say this, with not entirely ignorant of it, because even though I have never experienced that, I've had a very, happy childhood in life. But I know a lot of people who have gone through that kind of hell, because I live in a community that is unfortunately, in the grips of alcoholism and drug addiction and violence and lack of resources in an impoverished rural area. So it does become a very, nightmarish thing. And you have to ask yourself what causes all this, what's the anatomy of it, what is, but anyway, with all that aside, Lukyan's best trait is that I think he wants to love, very similar to Nikolai. um so he did love his brother very much. Their mother had unfortunately died when they were young, so this pretty much left the brothers very hardened without any kind of, other, you know parental influence or anything like that. They didn't have really many relatives. They just pretty much had their father and a couple of like work hands and servants, and that was it. You know. I think Lukyan also kind of has another positive trait, was that ironically, he actually really loved Irina, Dasha's mother, but she didn't love him back because she just, it's just one of those things. It just wasn't there. And also, she just didn't really like him, the fact that he was very cold. And Lukyan's a sort of person where he wants to do something, but he doesn't know how to communicate it. He doesn't know how to go forth and grab it, um, or convey it. And that's very frustrating. It's like being in a country, you don't speak the language, but you wouldn't want to communicate with everybody, but you can. Um, and it's very sad that he kind of let a lot of other negative things. The fact that Irina loved, spoiler alert, just spoiler, um, Irina actually really loved Danilo, and there's just a lot of complications. Her family didn't want her to marry Danilo because, the family had been going through a hard time, her family and Danilo's family, and they're like, okay, not financially stable, um, marry Lukyan instead because he's got the cold cash, baby. And she ended up doing that, and she's quite miserable. She doesn't love Lukyan, although Lukyan loves her. And unfortunately, there was a very intense rivalry between Lukyan and Danilo, and there was like a big fight. And, I mean, it was one of those things where these two men almost killed each other. And, it's kind of like out here, call the cops, But, so thank goodness they were living far apart. Now, ironically, now that there's been this land rotation, now their neighbors like smack next to each other on the fence. Irony, like, how old's Dasha? Like 13, 15 years later. Irony right there. Well, more like 17 years, but who's counting? Um, so yeah, that would have to be one of his positive traits. He wants to love, but he can't, which is a sad thing. So it's the potential. Worst traits. Lukyan has an unnerving need to control, and this leads to sudden bursts of violence. I mean, this can be physical violence, this can be emotional violence. He's not really verbally violent. I mean, he's not the sort to shout and scream obscenities or anything like that. But it actually makes him more scarier that he will resort to, very quick physical force. So that makes him all the more terrifying to watch out. Um, I think another thing is not only, control, but I don't think he likes his authority to be threatened. I think it stems from the fact being, with his father, he had no sense of control and he kind of felt like his life was dictated to him. And then I guess he kind of liked the power he had as an officer, and I will say he wasn't popular at all. His men hated him and they were kind of glad, oh, he's dead. Oh, okay, hope we get someone new. But that I would have to say, just to sum it up in a nutshell, is would be his best and worst traits, I would think.
Thank you for the great summary. I think that lends us a very deep insight into how Lukyan is like as a person, for good or for better. Just like a real character, that feels like a real person should be, you've really laid out what traits, he has that makes him a very well balanced. And even though he's a villain, he feels very flesh and blood.
Yeah, exactly. And it's one of those things where I guess I want to use the term opposition, perhaps, because um, it's just I don't know how to describe it. People will meet people like that in life. There's always going to be conflicts in life, and there's going to be people who life is often like a stage, and we are often, the players, and there's always going to be a main player or a side player or whatever.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
And I just wanted to also ask you, what does Dasha think about Lukyan? Obviously, she's very scared of him. She's very frustrated at how controlling he is. But does she ever feel conflicted about her feelings? Does she ever feel like she has to like him more because he's her father?
That's a very, very good question. I think that's a problem so many people in an abusive household have to face and really consider. Um, I think Dasha, even though the outside core of it, she does essentially hate him in her own icy cold clenched fist way. Um, I think in some way she can sense that her father wants to love, but he can't. And I think it hurts her that he can't because she wants to do that as well. But because of how he's made her this way and she can't do it either. So it's like no one in this house is speaking any languages. And I think she wants to. And I think Dasha's very scared that she is a lot like her father in a way. I mean, maybe not the violent part, but the fact that she's very dead inside. And Dasha, I think, does feel conflicted at some points, but there is a catalyst event in her life that pretty much shatters whatever remnant of conflicted love she wanted to have for her father. Because I mean, it wasn't like 100% all the time, terror. I mean, there were some very, quiet moments. It was mostly quiet all the time. It's just sort of a deadening silence, but I mean, there were some times where, some instances where, Dasha kind of realized, I guess he does maybe love me, in his own weird, crazy ass way. And I want to love him back, but I don't know how. And, it's those painful instances. And I think that's a lot of that's so much that so many people have told me that they have gone through as children and adults of unfortunately abusive parents. And I don't think anybody grows up. I mean, nobody wakes up in the morning thinking with pure intent malice that I just want to make everybody miserable or anything. It's just a thing that happens, unfortunately. I mean, there are people like that, but the sad case is, in many abusive households, that's just not the case. And it's a sad thing because um, a lot of them, in many cases, the abusers don't want to do it, but it happens. And it just becomes a very sick, twisted, warped thing. And it's up to those who are abused to somehow get out of it, or break the cycle. But yeah, I would have to say Dasha does, I think, feel conflicted up until the point there was a catalyst event, like I said, shatters any remnant of conflicted love that she might have wanted to hold for her father.
I see, I see. So what does Andrei think of Lukyan, especially after this dramatic, thing happens in their life? You're talking about this event that changes Dasha's view on Lukyan, and are you ready to reveal what it is and how Andrei reacts to it?
Okay. Trigger warning to anybody. Well, I mean, if you've listened to our podcast, you know what you came for, or you know what you're getting into. Um, so let's set the scene. Okay. Andrei is 15 at the time. Dasha has just turned 15 because like Andrei's about like 4 or 5 months older than her. Um, Lukyan has just returned from like an 8th month service term, and this has just been when the family had moved, right next on the fence to the Novoshkanovs. And, Dasha and her mom, needed a lot of help with their, property and stuff, like with the horses and the fields and stuff like that. And, this was often very common. Neighbors would work together. I mean, this is what you did to survive back in the day, prior to industrial farming. And Dasha and her mother have spent a lot of time with the Novoshkanov family. And it's just out of neighborly thing. I mean, sometimes, you're friends with your neighbors so close they kind of feel like family. And, there's been something kind of blossoming and taking root between Andrei and Dasha. And there's also been rumors of other stuff going on, that maybe Irina and Danilo have been reblossoming some stuff. But these are just rumors, really. I mean, I think maybe they would have wanted to have an affair, but they don't. It's just one of those aching, unrequited things that is very painful, and they kind of have to not think about it when they're in each other's presence, because they had loved each other very much so in their youth. Um, Unfortunately, dumbass rumors come spreading, and Lukyan, because of his need for obsessive control and the fact that he kind of had a, sort of a, I guess we could say, kind of a sick love for Irina. He's pretty much, have we just unleashed hell? We have just unleashed hell. So no sooner does he arrive home, and this is a little like late in the evening or so. Um, it's just a 1, 2, 3, and unfortunately, here's the big thing. So everybody prepare. Lukyan kills Irina. Yeah, and how it happened, I think it sort of started out as some physical violence, and then he ended up shooting her. And then, I mean, and then of course Dasha comes in because there's like lots of noise, finds out what's happening. And then there's physical violence between Lukyan and Dasha, and he ends up shooting her, and he thinks that they're both dead, and he's kind of terrified. Not so much terrified that he'll be caught, but that he's actually done something like unforgivable like that. And I don't know if he's running out to the step to like run away from the authorities for whatever reason, like just natural instinct, fight or flight, or if maybe he's contemplating that he needs an alone site to maybe commit suicide. It's hard to tell. But what happens is Andrei and his father find out what happened. They discover Irina's dead and badly bludgeoned body, and of course Dasha's pretty badly beaten up and shot too. And Danilo and Andrei pursue Lukyan on the step, and the reason they do this, you ask, why didn't they take him to court or have him arrested or whatever. The thing is, Lukyan, with his rank and everything, he could have easily just said it was an accident or something, or get away with it, or anything. I mean, this is says, Tsarist era Russian Empire we're talking about is very corrupt. I mean, just ask Gogol. So they know that the only justice they're going to get, which is something that happened a lot out in the steppes, particularly in Cossack communities, was a form of vigilante justice. And Andrei and Danilo pursue him, track him down, and they kill him. Especially Andrei does the majority of killing him, because Andrei's just filled with this fury that someone could have hurt Dasha and potentially killed her for like very stupid ass reason. And Andrei just unleashed the full extent of his fury and really, killed Lukyan, and not even like upset, disturbed his father a bit. This boy's only 15 years old. So this is the first time Andrei has killed. And I guess we could say it is justified, but I think, like I said, it is unfortunately a cycle of violence. And this is the cataclysm event that said, not only like shattered, like I said, whatever conflicted love Dasha would have had, but I think it shows the culmination of what happens when these cycles are not repaired or anything like that. And I mean, this unfortunately happens. I see it all the time, like in my local community. We recently had, last year, we recently had a mother of 5 children who was killed by her husband out of just nonsense. And now these kids don't have a mother, and the father's in prison, and the grandmother has to raise them, and it's a very sad thing. And I just open up the paper or look on something on local news or Instagram or Facebook, not Facebook, but you see it. There's just this awful thing of violence and abuse, and if it's never taken care of, it will lead to things like this. It'll lead to things like violence and death, and a never-ending cycle, and really, just really destroying and hardening people.
Yes, that's very realistic. And I like how you drew upon real life to illustrate this very delicate issue.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I didn't want to shy away from it. I didn't want to go too extreme like Sholokhov and do that all the time and never show anything happy or positive. But at the same time, I didn't want to completely shy away from it. And I did want to show that unfortunately, no matter what the society, no matter what the community, no matter where you're located, no matter who you are, these things do exist, unfortunately, because that is unfortunately one of the flip sides of human nature. And it's something that we constantly have to be vigilant about, be involved in communities and help, people and things like that. And then, recognize it, whether it's in our own family or someone else's family, pardon me, before it culminates into something tragic.
I agree. Yeah. So I would also want to ask you, what are the biggest issues you've had while developing Lukyan as a character? How do you think what kind of advice can you give to the audience about developing a character that has so many negative traits? And, because you've really mastered the art of making a negative character without turning him into a caricature or a typical Bond villain, for example. What kind of advice would you give a writer who is tackling these kind of characters and these kind of controversial themes?
That's a very excellent question. I think that's something so many people struggle, because as a writer, you don't want to ameliorate or justify anything that this person does, because it truly is horrible and it should be condemned. But at the same time, you have to separate the crime from the criminal, from the committer. And I think you have to realize, how do I say, there are truly some people who are irredeemable. They exist. They are out there, like serial killers and, people, like political people that go on mass genocide. I mean, they are, it truly makes you think, good Lord, the devil is real. And, but at the same time, most ordinary people, unfortunately, will fall, maybe fall into things like this. And I think you got to think about that. So as a writer, when you're having a negative character, you have to think of them as a person, and not so much like think about their life, what shaped it. Now, of course, you want to avoid what's been a problem in the creative community of woobifying, the person. And of course, we've seen this with villains like, I mean, I don't need to tell you about the army of fangirls for like villains like Loki or something. We all know that terror from 2012 on Tumblr. But what I'm meaning is, you can't just say, oh, excuse it. Oh, they are this, you can say these events molded them to do that. But at the same time, you have to say they should have done something to correct it, or there should have been people to help correct it. But you don't justify. You don't say, oh, he's doing this because, yes, but that doesn't justify it, And you can't just say, oh, this person's just suffering nobly. They are not. They are suffering, but it is not noble. Some people create their own suffering, and it's up to them to break that. And unfortunately, some people don't know how, or they're not willing. And those that don't know how, I think they should really strive hard to get help, or seek something to help them get out of that. So essentially what I want to give to writers for advice when you're doing this kind of character, think about them like real people. Think about their history. Think about their past. Think about the influences that, molded them and what shaped them. And also to think about what is the external factor influencing them and what they have inside. For example, Lukyan has all these negative things, and also he's in a somewhat toxic masculine culture as well. But at the same time, he unfortunately, the tragedy of it is that he does have these good traits he wants to love, but he doesn't know how. I mean, he loved his brother very much, his little brother was the world to him and everything, because that was the only family member he had that he could love and that loved him back. And then, he kind of had this love for Irina, but it's kind of like a distant ideal love, like the concept of love, of being able to love someone and just think about, oh, they're so wonderful and stuff like that. And unfortunately, the real tragedy, the kicker in the teeth is she doesn't love him back. There's nothing, I mean, it's cold, it's dead, it's ashes. And so you have to think about that. Think about the external, but then think about what's the internal. And of course, above all, never justify it, but do explain. Explain, but do not excuse. For example, I do not excuse anything that Lukyan does. And I know if we talk to Andrei's going to, once we get past all the obscenities that he uses to describe Lukyan, we know that he certainly doesn't condone anything that happened either. But at the same time, we kind of see what led up to that. And that is the unfortunate thing. So basic advice to writers: think of the characters, no matter how negative they are, as real people. Think about their history, what influenced them, what's the external factor as against to ruling, what is the internal factor of them, and above all, try to explain the actions, and or at least depict them in a way that doesn't glorify or excuse them or romanticize them, but just shows the mere stark tragedy of what happens when these things happen.
That's some really good advice, Tete. Thank you so much for sharing.
You're very welcome.
Similarly, in another vein, how would you say that you've managed to tackle controversial themes such as domestic abuse? How do you think writers, especially historical fiction writers, can balance, modern sensibilities with, historical truth? Because in the past, for example, there was a lot more domestic abuse than now, and a lot of the stuff that we think is wrong now was normalized. So how do you, as a modern writer, tackle this?
It, I think a lot of people have the main hindrance to I think a lot of people have is the fact that here's two things. One, the audience is going to assume the author has the same viewpoints. Audience, we do not. We don't have the same viewpoints as many as what people had back then. We have evolved as society, globally, in any community, we have evolved. So we do not hold the same viewpoints. We are merely showing what they held. You cannot fit, as we had discussed with our very good friend and amazing creator, Hellevorn, you can't put 21st ethic lens on whatever time you're doing. I mean, even 20 years ago, people had different ideas about things. And 20 years from now, as we are talking, there may be a different, more advanced, ethical viewpoints that are established. But the problem is you're really going to have to face the ugly reality. You want to show maybe characters who have a pivotal point where they think, okay, this doesn't feel right. I sort of want to go against it a little bit. Not everything, but the little spark. And that's what keeps pushing humanity forward. So yes, there are a lot of things that were accepted. For example, a lot of things like domestic violence that we would consider domestic violence nowadays. Even things like marital rape were considered very part and parcel of normal domestic life. When you deal with that, you have to ask yourself, what kind of character are you writing? How are they going to react? Would they ever engage in that? For example, Andrei does not engage in any kind of domestic violence because he's seen the horrors of it. He don't want none of that. He never wants to do that. I mean, he'd rather, I don't know, a train hit him or get sent to a gulag or something, or get eaten by dogs or, than do that. Andrei's family, for example, I think there was really no cause for domestic violence. I think everybody was generally healthy, open, and communicative. Maybe there were some, little bit of toxic, here and there dashes of it because just of the society and how things were back then, mostly from his grandfather, because his grandfather's like a real rough and tumble type of, Cossack man. And, he tends to, kind of yell, and he's, slightly, how to say, sexist. No, grandpa's really sexist, but whatever. Danilo has never really had any problems like that. I mean, he's just a very quiet guy, and Andrei's mother was very quiet as well. So they just got along. Like he didn't love her, unfortunately, and I think he kind of felt guilty when she died that he never really, really loved her. It was more of a duty thing, and that I guess maybe that kind of hurt her a little bit, but she was just the sort of woman, if it hurt her, she wouldn't show it. She'd just kind of smile through the tears, sort of like a Ghibli heroine. But um, but yeah, how you tackle that is that you have to realize there is that reality, but remember the character is the main driving force. How do they react? Are they going to do it? What situation is going to prompt them to do these things? And you have to see how are they going to have their viewpoints on it. Are they going to be maybe a bit radical and progressive, like I don't want any of this, they're thinking. Or are they going to be more accepting of it, but like, yeah, I know everybody does it, but I don't really do it? Or are they going to engage in it, and that's going to create a morally gray, complicated, um, ethical structure for that? You have to think of those questions, and that's the tough thing to do. But it's something that has to be done, and that's something that I've certainly had to do with the whole cast of characters, like the Navoshkina family, the Tarsievs, and other people that we're going to be meeting in this novel. So that's the advice I would impart to writers who are dealing with that.
Thank you so much. That is amazing. And I think it really sums up the points that you really wanted to make. Do you have any last words to share about the character of Lukyan and this whole subject of, discussing, very controversial topics in historical fiction?
I would have to say, similar to what we had with Nikolai, um, I think sometimes people are pushed by external factors. It doesn't excuse them, because perhaps maybe something should have been done. But I guess the lasting words I just want to impact on people who want to explore this is just to remember that there's duality in all human beings. There is positive, negative, and it just depends what's going to be influenced, what's going to overtake it. And everything will be morally gray sometimes, and that will be a painful thing to do. But as a creator, if you want to be true to life, if you want to be true to your characters and treat them as real people and give them their own agency, rather than put them in a paragon of virtue or a caricature of villainy and evil, you have to ask yourself, real life is painfully and morally gray, and there is a duality, there is a two-sided coin of tragedy, pain, and unfortunately things that just happen. And so that's what I want to impart on characters like Lukion, in a similar vein to Nikolai, Gleb's father, and to hopefully that might help people out there who have a negative person but are afraid of turning them into, like, a stock caricature villain. So if hopefully this might give some insight to people who have to deal with the nitty gritty nastiness of what life was like back then, and even some of the things we face today. I'm hoping that this does give some people insight in how to tackle that.
I think that's wonderful advice. Thank you so much for your time today, Tete. We learned a lot, and I can't wait to learn more about your novel as you continue to write further into it.
Thank you so much. There will be so much more to explore and so much coming. Don't let the 90 pages fool you if anybody has read it or bought it. There is a lot more. It is going to be like a 400, 500 page novel. We have a lot of life to cover because we've got 70 years to cover.
Thank you so much once again.
Thank you so much for having me. You're an excellent interviewer. I love your questions, and thank you so much for everything.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.